Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Coffin. This motion for resolution is meant to counter a measure within the current Commission implementing regulation based on events of imports from Japan. The Commission has amended Annex 2, dropping from now on the requirements of certain products. It's also changed the geographical cover because the prefectures of Chiba, Tochigi, and Iwate, which I actually visited myself, which are thought to be contaminated by radioactivity following Fukushima, but the Commission is saying, oh, we don't need any more sampling, we don't need to carry out measurements. The Japanese authorities are taking proper steps. They have lower levels than ours. They protect their health a lot more than we do. In Europe, I should add in passing. But without an explanation as to why certain samples are being taken out of the picture, why certain prefectures are affected have been dropped, what criteria have they used, I wonder, to put forward this repressive regulation? And then there's another concern. What is actually being analysed? You will be aware that the Fukushima accident had a huge impact in two different isotopes of cesium with half-lives of 2 and 4 years. This was C135 and 137 respectively. Now, a considerable amount of cesium was emitted and is still being emitted from the Fukushima power station because the core is still being hosed down. And you've got a lot getting out into the water. Resins are used to try and filter out other radioactive elements, strontium and so forth, and that's dumped in containers. There's only cesium-134 and cesium-137 measures being taken. We would like to add strontium with a half-life of 28 years, which is being emitted into the water, amongst other substances. And then another problem, you'll probably know that we're importing rice from Japan, actually to feed to nursing infants. Like the Chinese and the Koreans and the Australians, we are saying, why import contaminated rice with 50 becquerels? You know, when you can get rice from elsewhere without a single becquerel. So, I'm going to say, stop importing rice for infants. And then another concern, you'll be aware that a Japanese delegation was there last week, and I asked them this directly. There are millions of cubic meters being stored at Fukushima at the moment in containers. Now, I am calling upon the Commission to ensure that samples are taken to establish exactly what's within those tubes. They're saying there's only tritium, but there's strontium, there's a whole range of radioactive substances there. There were links with certain people in government and this industry. They wanted to keep it all quiet, and they've just been discharging stuff into the Pacific. We have no measurements for tritium, although millions of cubic meters are being discharged into the Pacific. It's going to hit the fish and the whole environment, and eventually us. So Europe has a role to play. There's a free trade agreement with Japan, don't forget. And so I would ask you to vote in favour of this motion so that we can apply pressure to the Commission to remove its regulation and come forward with a new proposal by April next year at the latest, so that we can ensure a high level of protection for human health and the environment, and also to obtain extra information on what is going on in Japan and tell us why we should be importing contaminated Japanese food.
Thank you, Chair. I'm replacing Mr. Kanev, who is the EPP Shadow Rapporteur on this file and cannot be present today. Mr. Kanev is against this objection. His position is based on the reliability of the currently applied control that reveals the data submitted by the Japanese authorities for 2017 and 2018, and the provided evidence for no exceedance of the maximum levels of radioactivity in observed feed and food originating during the AIDS growing season after the accident. He considers, as an additional argument against the objection, the free trade agreement with Japan. With this regard, he would like to underline that the European Commission shall provide the European Parliament with more and detailed information as a matter of the relations between the two institutions, but this problem shall not be attributed to the relations and exchange between the EU and Japan. And to conclude, the EPP will reject this objection tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. For SND.
Tak for det.
Thank you. Thank you for this discussion. I'd like to say to Ms. Rivasi, I can understand that there are concerns about our food and feed. We make sure that with the food and feed coming into the EU is all right. When it comes to these objections, there are two topics. Firstly, data transparency, and secondly, the cooling water. Data transparency, we have the data provided, asked for by members. Secondly, the cooling water. I think there is a demand when it comes to this water. We don't. What will happen to that before 2021? I would like to do something in the EU when it comes to raising awareness about the cooling water. I don't think it should be done in connection with this type of objection. In the S&D, we will not support the objection, even though we share the concerns about the cooling water. We think that we should activate the Commission when it comes to the cooling water in Fukushima, and we should deal with it in another way. So no to supporting this objection, but yes to doing something about dealing with the concerns about the cooling water.
Thank you. For Renew, Véronique Trier-Lenoir.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, even if there hasn't been a single incident noted since these checks were carried out, and even if, dear Michel, raising the ban is something that maybe doesn't affect all foodstuffs, and even if the threat at the moment on tipping this water out into the Pacific has been raised by the minister concerned, we will be voting in favour of this objection because we believe it to be important to protect citizens against any carcinogens, be it this sort of carcinogen or ones we've been discussing earlier today, where you can't really have a big fight against carcinogens in the Parliament without dealing with radioactivity. As you have said, we need more transparency, we need more visibility, so we'll follow you on this objection.
Merci. For ID.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. Speaking in a personal capacity, I don't believe many people in our group would wish there to be discrimination on political grounds. We will support Ms. Rivasi's objection because health must prevail over mere political considerations. The points made by Ms. Rivasi apply, and there's also good reasons to be suspicious. Very often we've had to give our views on texts where the information hadn't always been borne out by a sufficient number of independent studies, and evidence all too often been overlooked. When we're talking about carcinogens, this is my concern here, there are a variety of factors feeding into this risk. Each of these risks taken together, if you look at its cumulative effect, should require us to be even more demanding, even if the figures provided look fairly reassuring. For all these reasons, we will be backing this objection. Thank you.
For ECR.
We disagree with the objections because of three reasons. First, it's arbitrarily selective, as the conditions for import have been revised 15 times in the past. Secondly, the Japanese standard for testing radiocesium is more restrictive than the maximum permitted here in Europe. And thirdly, no instances of non-compliance have been found at import control for over 7 years.
Thank you. And for the GUE.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, the Commission's proposing to start marketing the food that is grown near Fukushima and fish in the water around there, and they were at least going to check the foodstuffs. Now, the tests here seem to be based on Japanese tests alone, not on our own tests. Can the Commission confirm that the Japanese testing is not too restrictive and doesn't show the full range of radioactivity possible? Is it right that there are Japanese entrepreneurs are intending releasing radioactive water into the sea, not just dangerous for the local conditions, but also for the sea life? And how can we turn Japanese views around on that plan if all the trade preferences were to be removed, for example? Could it be that here we are looking at one of the most dangerous mechanisms of the free trade agreements coming into effect, or should we believe that it's by happenstance that briefly after the coming into force of the free trade agreement with Japan, that safety standards have been lowered rather than the question of regulatory cooperation? How can we allow trade at any cost with Japan being promoted, where they have started commercial whale fishing and where thousands of dolphins are brutally murdered each year? We're going to vote in favour of this objection. We hope to get support for it as well.
Give the floor to DG Santé for 2 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, Madame la députée.
Thank you, Chairman. Distinguished members.
Restrictive measures as regards the import of feed and food from Japan due to possible radioactive contamination, with the aim to ensure a high level of human health protection. These measures are reviewed every 2 years now. The Japanese authorities perform a very extensive control of the presence of radioactivity on cesium-134 and 137 for their agriculture production. The individual analytical results on the presence of radioactivity from these extensive controls, and there are more than 300,000 a year, samples analyzed since 2011, are publicly available and regularly updated, so they are accessible and published. Also, the competent authorities from the member states perform controls on the presence of radioactivity in food and feed imported from Japan. And as was mentioned, has been no non-compliance been observed since June 2011. We pay a special attention when considering the criteria for revising the measure, and we do a careful examination of the extensive control data provided by the Japanese authorities, and of course the outcome of the controls performed by the competent authorities of the member states at import. For a food or feed from a Japanese prefecture, we only propose no longer requiring a pre-testing for compliance before export, only if no non-compliance, with the strict levels applicable in Japan has been found in that feed or food from the prefecture during the last year, on the condition, of course, that sufficient analytical results are available. For the prefecture Fukushima, a more cautious approach is followed, and there it's for the last 2 years where the results are considered. As Ms. Rivasi mentioned, the maximum levels applicable from food from Japan are very low as compared to those from, for example, the Chernobyl incident, or those who would be applicable if there was a nuclear accident in Europe. So the proposed changes to Commission implementing regulation, the last one, are based upon about 100,000 analytical results on the presence of radioactivity in a wide range of foodstuffs, except beef, and about 530,000 analytical results on beef from the 7th and the 8th growing season, which goes from January 2017 to December 2018. As already mentioned, the changes are made following a detailed analysis of this data, and a detailed justification of the proposed changes has been provided to the honourable member upon request. The Commission continues, of course, to monitor the situation by regularly verifying the analytical results from the controls performed by the Japanese authorities and the outcome of import controls. If needed, this decision could be revised or reviewed any time if we had new elements. We are regularly informed on the state of play concerning the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, and in particular the fate of the radioactively contaminated waste and cooling water. Here again, the Japanese authorities have committed to inform the Commission at an early stage of any possible decision taken as regards the fate of the stored radioactively cooling water, and here, if needed, depending on this fate, we would be ready to act. So the Commission is therefore the opinion that with the application of the strict criteria and the availability of the extensive data, the proposed draft regulation continues to ensure a very high level of human health protection, and we consider thus that we are of the opinion, that the Commission does not exceed its implementing powers provided for in the General Food Law Regulation 178/2002 by adopting this draft Commission implementing decision.